It works. We're on. Okay. So, the new season, the winter. Winter's here. We're here. And we've advanced in the narratives of the Torah. So we were discussing the early days of Jewish people, almost the precursor to Judaism. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the forefathers, a book of Genesis, of Bereshit. And those stories are about individuals, about families, about people. Yeah. When we get to the Exodus, the Shemais, suddenly now we're open up to a new dynamic of a nation. So it's a transition from individuals to the collective. And that's first experienced. Transition happened throughout the period of exile, throughout their time of slavery. But the first time we find them as a nation as a whole is when they're going out of Egypt. God then says, you become my nation, the Jewish people. They receive a Torah at Sinai collectively. And so we have this slow transition into peoplehood, to nation.
Question: just because all the Jewish people, wherever they're having to work, went into Egypt to escape famine? Is that when Joseph was?
Yes.
So that's how they got from Israel, whatever.
The family of Jews, meaning at that point it was Jacob, his kids and grandkids. 70 people. Torah lists the 70 people, or 70 men, probably more than 70 people.
Yeah.
But that's the whole group. It's a family, an extended family. We encounter them now again 200 years later, millions of people.
Boy, they really multiply.
Right, they really multiply. The Midrash picks up on this, almost inconsistency. So how they get so big?
I was wondering about that. That's why I've always wondered about that.
And the Midrash says that they had a miracle from God. They used to have 6 kids at a time.
Yikes.
Right? Yikes.
Lucky you're not one of them. 6 at once?
We'll stick to one, right? And that's
okay. Yeah.
That's how we have in such a short time frame the explosive growth. So now they are a people. They're a nation. But I wanted tonight focus on just the very beginning of that. Here's the story. We know the story of Moses comes to Pharaoh and he says, I have a message from God, let my people go. The Jewish people have to let free. Pharaoh laughs at him and says, who's this God? I don't know who he is. And Moses says, okay, I'll prove his muscle. And the plagues come. We have 10 plagues altogether, right? This week, in this week's Torah portion, are the last 3 plagues. So we have locusts that destroy all the crop. We have darkness. For a week, it's absolute darkness in Egypt. And then, finally, the cherry on top, the final straw that broke Pharaoh's back, the death of the firstborns. Makas Bechoros.
Are those only male firstborn or all firstborn? Do you know?
I'm
sorry. I should have shut my phone off.
Was it sons or?
a male firstborn, I'm pretty sure. Though it was a very inclusive definition of firstborn. So either firstborn from the mother or from the father. So in other words, it was more than just a strict firstborn, one per family. So the way we usually think of the story is after that point the Jews finally leave, and then they become, after that they go to Sinai. 7 weeks later, which is we count the Sefirat Omer till Shavuot, 7 weeks later they become a Jewish people, right? And this is somewhat conflicting sources of when the nation is born. Is it born in the Exodus of Egypt, or is it born at the giving the Torah at Sinai? And clearly there are stages in the birth of the Jewish nation. But we'd assume either when they leave Egypt or once they receive the Torah. But what we encounter in this week's Torah portion is something very interesting. The first mitzvah, the first commandment given to the Jewish people, is in between the 9th and 10th plague. So they're still under Egyptian rule. Pharaoh has not given them respite, hasn't allowed them to go. And in the middle of the hullabaloo, right? They had a plague of darkness, and there's about to be a massive uproar with the plague of the firstborns. And in between them, there's a civil war in Egypt, people trying to convince Pharaoh to let the Jews go. And at that moment, God pulls Moses and Aaron aside and says, I have a special, unique mitzvah I want to give you. What's the mitzvah? What's the first mitzvah? What would you think is the very first mitzvah God wants to communicate to the Jewish people, even before they've officially become a free nation?
We have to sacrifice an animal and paint our door.
Okay, good. One of the mitzvahs, he tells them, is the Paschal lamb, right? And that, of course, is very timely, because they have to do that, take the animal 4 days before the Exodus. He wants them to take it on the 10th of Nisan. So to take the animal had to come before the actual plague which led to the freedom. But before he tells them that, that's the second mitzvah he tells them. Before he tells them the Paschal lamb, he introduces a different mitzvah. He says, the first thing I want you to tell the Jewish people is this. And then he gets into the practical side to take a lamb. What do you think, or if you know, is the very first mitzvah that the Jews got?
I don't know the answer, but
Yeah, say yes. What would you think it would be?
acknowledge there's one God.
Okay, that's the first of the Ten Commandments. You think it's the first,
First
right?
one, yeah.
Maimonides, in his code of law, says the very first mitzvah is to know there's a God, right?
Yeah, that's what I would
He's
think.
not speaking about chronologically. He's speaking about order of importance.
Right.
But you would think that has to come first.
You'd think.
Without God, what's anything else worth?
Exactly. Yeah.
Was it Shabbos?
No. Shabbos was given to them before Sinai on one of their travels, but not this early. So the very first thing God tells Moshe and Aaron, he says, "Hachodesh hazeh lachem." This shall be for you the first month of the year. And the way they always understood this is to mean God took them out, showed them the moon. It says, I want you to calculate the cycle of the moon to follow a lunar calendar. And the month of the lunar month we're in now will be the first month of your year, which we now know to be called Nisan. In Torah it's called Chodesh Harishon, the first month. Once he's laid down the groundwork, the foundation of the Jewish people, of a nation, he says, now we can get in details. I want you to take a Paschal lamb and take you free from Egypt and escape. Now, besides the fact that the calculations go into calculating a lunar cycle, a lunar calendar, are complex. There's a lot of math involved, right? Figuring out the moon and the rotations of the moon, and I'm sure Moses and Aaron didn't have the headspace at that moment in the thick of things in Egypt to really sit and study it. So it may not be the most appropriate time for God to introduce it. But more than that, why is this so urgent? And why is this the very first thing we have? The very first instruction as Jewish people is that we should follow a lunar calendar. Fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I didn't know this at all.
Very, very little known.
Yeah, it is.
It's and if you look at the story in the Parsha, and if you get a chance to read the Parsha this week, it literally slips under the radar, because there's the whole thing, the plague of darkness, and Moses, the whole altercation with Pharaoh, and then it's like 3 verses, and straight away goes into a long speech about details of the Paschal lamb. It almost gets overlooked, but it's the very first one. So there are a number of explanations given, a number of ideas. I want to discuss them tonight, and some are very poignant and relevant, and can teach us a lot about Judaism and a lot about ourselves as well. On a most basic level, this was God teaching the Jewish people how to be free. They, for hundreds of years, were steeped in slavery. So more than just actual labor, it became their mindset. They were slaves. They were used to being dictated what to do, when to do it, how it should get done. Just following instructions. And that became the mentality. You know, people develop that mentality. Even once they're sort of freed, they're lost. They don't know what to do with themselves. Right? Happens with prisoners. People who serve these long sentences go out of prison and they face now this anxiety. They miss the routine they had in prison. They reoffend sometimes just to get back into prison, right? Because that's the comfort zone for them. So the Jewish people, they had the slave mentality. What is the difference between a slave and a free person? Is it the amount of hours they work?
No, the slave is someone's property. The slave doesn't belong to himself.
But
It's somebody's property.
what does it mean practically?
That
Meaning,
they never have the ability to do for themselves anything. Everything they have to do is what someone's telling them to do. They can't act for themselves. They can't act for their own benefit. They can't. They're totally the creature of whoever owns them.
if I'm understanding you correctly, that means that a slave may not work harder or more hours than a free person.
Correct.
That may or may not be. You have people on Wall Street or lawyers that can work 20 hours a day, right, for 10 years just to get themselves a footing in their career.
Right.
And that means they're following instructions. They're literally working hard, long hours. And the slaves, some slaves are treated well. There are definitely periods in history where slaves were treated well. Torah instructs us back in the day when they had slaves, and it was considered okay. There are detailed instructions on how to treat a slave, moral treatment of slaves. But the idea is that a slave has no control over their time.
Right.
So when their master says it's time to wake up, they have to wake up. Now it's time for work, they have to work. They are just being controlled. Their time is being set for them, their schedule set for them.
Right.
A free person controls his or her time. You may work longer, but I've decided I'm going to invest myself in this work at this time. No one can force me. I'm a free person. You hope at least, right?
Yeah.
So being in control of time is the hallmark of freedom. So when the Jewish people were about to go free, God told them the very first step is you have to create a calendar. You have to take control of your own time, of your own life. And this is something which we can all relate to in a certain way. Because often in life, we get stuck. We're not slaves, but we get controlled by others, right? Our job controls us. Our responsibilities control us. Friends, whatever it is, that we almost feel like overwhelmed. We have to follow this schedule, fit into these activities, and I have to go, I have to run, I have to go there, I have to get this done. But if we would stop and say, I'm setting my calendar, I'm choosing my hours to the degree that I can. So in advance, I'm the one controlling how I spend my time, then I'm a free person. I'm controlling my life. So you're taking control over time. Because at the end of the day, everything exists in the context of time. Time is sort of the cement that everything is glued together with. Right? I have a couch here. This couch only exists in a certain time. It was here. It was somewhere else. Now it's here. It didn't exist. Now it's built. So this couch, its existence, exists in a certain time. The time is the context of the world.
Yeah.
And if time controls us, then we are just being pulled by strings like a little puppet. But we're in control of time, then our whole life is in our hands, in our control. That's the most basic understanding of it. One step further. God told the Jewish people to create a lunar cycle, which is unique. Right? Today, the classic, the Gregorian calendar, the solar cycle, follows the seasons, which most agricultural societies would have done. And the lunar cycle follows the moon every 29 and a half days. Approximately is a new moon, quote unquote, a reemergence of the moon, and that we can see it. And what God told the Jewish people is, I want you to calculate the rotations of the moon and declare the new months. So it's a fascinating area of Jewish law, and it serves as a precedence to other areas, that the Bet Din, the Jewish courts, were in charge of setting months, and there was no objective truth in the calendar. Which means, let's say scientifically, the rotation of the moon followed a certain pattern, and the re-emergence of the new moon would have been sighted on a Monday, right? But no one saw the moon. There were no Jews out there who could say, I saw it. Or people that saw it didn't come to the Beis Din, didn't come to the court in time. So Monday came and went, and it was not declared as Rosh Chodesh. A new month wasn't started. Only the next day, they got to announce it. So the new month was started the next day. Even though the moon cycle wasn't that way. So it was given over to the hands of the court to establish the calendar on an ongoing basis, even if it didn't reflect the truth. Right? And that's a crazy thing to think about, because this affects every area of Jewish life. The holidays. Whatever day the first day of the month is going to tell me when Yom Kippur is. If I change that date to the next day, Yom Kippur is a day later. Which day you have to fast? Which day can you eat? And the Talmud records a story of Rabban Gamliel. He was the head of the academy, the Nasi, the chief rabbi. And he had a student, Rabbi Yehoshua, who was a great rabbi in his own right. And there was tension between them. A few instances of conflict where they didn't get along. It's an interesting, little passage of history in its own right. But at one point, Rabbi Yehoshua felt that Rabban Gamliel made a mistake in his calculations of the new month. And Rabbi Yehoshua said that Tishrei, the month where Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are in, starts one day. Rabban Gamliel and the court set it for the next day. And Rabban Gamliel wanted to impress his authority. He told Rabbi Yehoshua, I want you to come, I'm actually instructing you to come on the day on your calendar is Yom Kippur, to come with your stick and your money sack. Basically, I want you to desecrate Yom Kippur, come to my house, we'll have a meal together. Right? And Rabbi Yehoshua followed suit. He followed the instructions. Rabbi Gamliel says, I give you a lot of credit and respect. But Talmud says, at the end of the day, even if Rabbi Yehoshua was right in the calculations, it's irrelevant. Because the courts determine the new months, given over to the hands of the people. And there's no, imposed date. There's no objective truth. It's all a subjective truth of the Jewish people. What we as a people, the courts representing us, decide. That's incredible, right? The most fundamental thing on the Jewish calendar, the holidays, are set by us, not by God. So God tells us what to do. We decide when to do them. Whereas Shabbat, for example, doesn't work that way. The seventh day of the week is the seventh day of the week. We can't decide, well, we're going to observe Shabbat on a Sunday, this week. It comes to us. We just accept the Shabbat, right? It's imposed on us. And this is actually reflected in the liturgy. On Shabbos, we say in the prayers, Baruch Atah Hashem, bless you God, Mekadesh HaShabbos, who sanctifies Shabbat. On the holidays, we say, Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim, who sanctifies the Jewish people, and by extension, their holidays. So we added the Jewish people because really God sanctified us, and we then have the power to sanctify the holidays. So we actually create the sanctity of the holidays through our determination of the dates. So one of the biblical commentaries, the Seforno, says something fascinating. He says, this is why God gave it to the Jewish people now. He says, this is the ultimate determination of freedom. Not only are you creating a calendar, You are the ones that set the calendar. God tells the Jews, I am giving this over to you, that you are in control of the calendar. You make a determination of when the calendar dates are going to be set. Obviously based on the calculations of the moon. But it has to be recorded, has to be done through the Jewish people, through the courts. And that was the freedom. Which is why the year suddenly shifted at that point. There's another really fascinating idea. When's the Jewish New Year?
Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah. That's the New Year, right?
Yeah.
When's the first month of the year?
It's Tishrei, right?
You would think Tishrei. But God told Moses at this point, when he's telling him about calculations of the new moon, he said, this should be the first month for you. Nisan, which is the 7th month from Tishrei, is called the first month. In fact, Tishrei in Torah is called the 7th month. So on the first day of the 7th month, we observe the new year.
I never realized.
Confusing, right?
Yeah.
So there ends up being 2 New Years. There's Tishrei being the beginning of a new year, and Nisan being the beginning of a new year. And they're both true, they're both right. So there's 2 calculations of time in Judaism. Creation is Tishrei. Rosh Hashanah is a creation of the world. It's a universal new year. The Jewish people were born in Nisan, the Exodus. It's the Jewish New Year. Okay? And we observe a universal New Year. We pray for the world. We focus on God as ruler of nature. And comes Pesach, we focus on God as ruler of the Jewish people. Our individual relationship with God. And the renewal of that. So, the Sephardim says the reason God wanted Nisan to be the beginning of the Jewish New Year is because since they gained their freedom then, and the calculation of the time is a sign of freedom, so the first month which the Jewish people were able to exercise that freedom is the first month of their year, of their calendar. So when it comes to months, Nisan is the new year. To years, Tishrei is the new year.
I never fully got that.
Let me make it one step more complicated.
Okay.
There's so much agency given. It's amazing.
Oh, it's incredible. And Judaism is really unique in that regard. That even, I mean, obviously there's agency given to us in our, in calculations of civil law and even to the degree moral law based on society. But even ritual law was given over to the courts to decide when Pesach should be. Right? Which is the whole Jewish calendar, which is really the fabric of Jewish life, revolves around this. Which is why there were 2 days we do keep in America, in diaspora, we keep 2 days of each holiday. Whereas originally in Torah it's 1 day. This comes from the fact we didn't know when the courts made the new month. Was it 29 days or 30 days, since it's a 29 and a half day cycle of the moon? So since they weren't sure, until they were able to get word of what happened in Jerusalem, they kept 2 days of the holiday just in case. And that's just kept on today. So because there was no objective, calculation, they had calculations. They had, Talmud describes that in the courts, when people would come to deliver their testimony, they saw the new moon, the rabbis would show them their detailed charts, which they had drawn up to know if the people's testimony could have been accurate or not. They asked them which side of the sky do you see it in, what time exactly. They knew it's not possible from where you're standing to see the reflection of the moon at that time. They had detailed charts. So they could have easily calculated Rosh Chodesh on their own, saving everyone a hassle. But God wanted to give the agency to the Jewish people. This is your responsibility, your authority, your mitzvah. You're in control of this. One step deeper, okay, a little more complicated. Before we go there, one more thing. in Judaism, time is obviously central.
Yeah.
Lifetime is central. And the Jewish calendar is a really important thing, which is today often neglected. Right?
Yeah.
People have no idea what date it is today in the Jewish calendar.
True, I don't know.
No one knows. When it comes to yard sites, you need a reminder, like, because it's the Jewish calendar yard site. When's it this year? When's Pesach this year? Late, early.
Yeah.
We don't. It's almost a lust beside the people that are very into it, which is very unfortunate because, as we're seeing here in this picture of the birth of the Jewish nation, the calendar was the blueprint to which Judaism was imprinted on, right? It tells us how to calculate the time. And the idea is that we can't change the time. Time moves. But how we count the time we can change. How we perceive time changes. And that makes all the difference. Time's flying by and it's moving so slow. Of course, time isn't moving faster or slower. Your perception of the time is changing. And so, if you can change the way you perceive time, you change the way you interact with time. You change the way you live. So God giving the Jewish people a way to interact with time. Not only, the first point was the fact that they are interacting with time. That's freedom. The fact that you do have that choice to create schedules and calendars. The second point is how you're going to interact with time. That you are actually in control. You create the calendar. That's a real expression of freedom. But the third point, God gave a very specific dynamic how the Jewish people should calculate the calendar. And bear with me for a second for a little complication. There's a lunar calendar and there's a solar calendar. What do we follow as Jews? What's the Jewish calendar?
It's a lunar calendar.
Lunar. The truth is the Jewish calendar is a hybrid.
Oh.
Because on the lunar calendar there are no years.
There are what?
No years. There's no moon year. There's a cycle of 29 and a half days of the moon that keeps repeating itself. There's no such thing as a year. There are months.
Yeah.
Right? On the solar calendar, there are no months. What does a month mean to the sun?
Yeah, it's angles.
There are seasons,
Yeah.
right? But the cycle of the sun is a year. It's 365 days. Arbitrarily, almost, on our secular calendar, we've divided in 12 months. But an actual month is a meaningless passage of time when looking at the sun. Right? February 1st, nothing happened to the sun, or in our perception of the sun, that we're starting a new month. We divided a year conveniently into 12 shorter segments. Right? So on a lunar calendar, there are months. On a solar calendar, there are years. In Islam, for example, they have a lunar calendar.
Yeah.
And they also have a 12-month year. But they only follow the lunar calendar, which is 12 lunar months are 354 days. So their year is 11 days shy of a solar year. So every year, they're losing sort of 11 days. So the year starts 11 days earlier, the second year, right? The third year starts 22 days earlier. And so their holidays keep changing seasons. Ramadan is a different time of year every year. It's 11 days earlier every year. Right? Because their year is shorter. So eventually it goes through a cycle. After every 3 months, it's basically a month earlier. Every 3 years, every 10 years, it's a different season. So the Jewish calendar isn't that way. Right? Pesach's always in March or April. And that's because God told Moses here that Pesach has to always be in the spring. So as much as we're following a lunar calendar, it is influenced by the solar calendar as well. So every 2 or 3 years, the Jewish calendar adds in a month. So we're following the moon cycles. we add in another cycle of the moon to the year to catch up with the seasons. This year Hanukkah was the beginning of December because it's a leap year. So we're going to have the next Adar, next month we have a second Adar.
That's
And
to catch
so-
up too.
To catch up, that we should jump ahead an extra month. So next year Hanukkah will be the end of December. We're catching up a month. We fell back a little bit, we're catching back up. So we keep in sync with the solar calendar.
Every 4 years?
Every 2 or 3 years.
2 or 3.
There are 7 leap years in a 19-year cycle. So it's worked out 2, 5, 7. So altogether, every 19 years of the cycle, there are 7 leap years. Probably a lot of complications. This is we're scratching the surface to the calendar. If I'm getting too complicated, let me know. Here's what I'm getting to though. Now that we've cleared the complications, why did God create for the Jewish people at this point in history such a complex calendar? And here's one beautiful idea. And I'll try to give it over in his brief because it's very deep idea. The lunar and solar calendar reflect 2 modes of being, 2 modes of time. The sun is a symbol of strength, of warmth. It emanates heat and light. It's a symbol of masculine energy. I don't mean masculine as men and women, because we all have masculine and feminine energy, but you'll hear what I mean in a second. There's masculine energy and feminine energy in the world. The masculine energy is the giver, is strength, is providing. There's a feminine energy, which is nurturing, cultivating. Right? So masculine energy imposes itself on someone else, whereas a feminine energy would cultivate something else. Right? Others. Masculine energy is strength, is a giver. Feminine energy is the receiver, is being able to take someone and nurture them. So we all, men and women, all have this masculine feminine dynamic, right? And different people have different balance of those energies. And the world, everything in the world, it lives in the balance of this masculine and feminine, of giving and receiving, of pushing and accepting. The sun is a symbol of that masculine energy, of that force of strength, of consistency, of heat, of giving. The moon, we only see the moon just reflects the sun's light, right? The moon is a symbol of the feminine energy. It just reflects sunlight. It's going through stages of renewal, right? It has to go through those stages, and it's reflected as well in this idea that the sun has a year, Shana, in Hebrew. The word Shana in Hebrew, Shinui, means to repeat, consistency. Whereas month in Hebrew, Chodesh, comes from Chadash, Chidush, renewal. Right? So the moon is the idea of renewal, of birth, of something, coming. Whereas the sun is the idea of just repetition, something just constantly being there. And as people, we interface with time on these 2 levels. The way we interact with the world on both of these levels. There's the way we can be sun people, right? We can impose our selves, even our spiritual selves, on the world, which is there's a certain truth what is pushing on the world, pushing our agenda, even positive agendas, pushing on people where we look at the world and say there's an objective truth out there and God has just given that to the world. Or we can have a more feminine approach to how we live, that see in things the good they have, see in people the good qualities they have and nurture that within them, or being able to give others space, which to create something different to who we are. And on a spiritual level, on a religious level, it's the idea of not imposing sort of a spiritual agenda on the world, but be able to nurture within the world its own spiritual depth. right? Everything in the world has a message, has a meaning. Be able to bring out the sparks of meaning that exist in every interaction we have, in every object. Allow them to express themselves. That's the lunar approach to life. At the outset of the Jewish people, God was telling them we need a balance of solar and lunar. It's tempting, and especially in spiritual traditions, to go to one extreme, right? Either to be ultra dogmatic, this is a truth from God and we're just pushing this on the world, this is the way God said it and this way it is, just follow.
Yeah.
Or to be so open and just allow everything to be, right? And there's no objective truth and everyone is okay to be how they are. And that expresses itself not only in that dynamic, but in a range of different areas. And the key is to have a balance. The key to our own lives is to have a balance in the masculine and feminine energies. And the key, God was telling Moses at this important junction for the Jewish people, that Judaism is going to be lived out in the balance between these two forces. On the one hand, there's the mitzvahs. The mitzvahs are following directives from God, right? We are just, God is the sun, and we are imposing that message, that image on the world. Do a mitzvah, it's going to create this energy, it's going to bring the truth to the world, impose it on the world. But, together with that, there's a spirit in Judaism that, first of all, Judaism isn't only played out in mitzvahs, it's life in general, between mitzvahs, how we live that life, that really carries weight as to how dedicated we are to God and to what change we create in the world. But also the way we do a mitzvah, the way we bring our own energy into the mitzvah, the way we say that the course decided when the new month should be, right? That's the idea that the Chodesh, Chidush, we are creating new energies. We're not just imposing God's energy on the world, we're actually being able to bring up our own energies. So, freedom can be lived out on either of these poles, on a lunar freedom, on a solar freedom. But God was giving Moses and Aaron to tell the Jewish people the Jewish vision for freedom, what God wanted from the Jewish people once they became free, was to live in the constant balance in lunar and solar. And the whole of Jewish life is played out on this field, on this calendar. And so it's almost like the calendar is a tapestry of time which our lives are painted upon. And that idea of bridging the two energies, of being able to balance both of those and live out between them, is what Judaism calls for. And it expresses itself, we can go on this for forever. In almost every area of Jewish life, this dichotomy, these always two sides of the coin that we're constantly living out between. But the key is to recognize that neither of them can exist on their own. And either extreme is veering off from the original blueprint that God set out for the Jewish people in Torah. On an individual level, on a personal level, the same thing is true. We have to be in relationships, in the way we interact with people, the way we behave. There's this constant struggle as well. How much do we impose ourselves versus how much do we give others room? How much do we, have the masculine energy of consistency versus the spur of the moment inspiration, right? How much do we follow logic versus creativity and taking risks? So these are a constant thing, and finding the balance between them is a struggle. But Judaism gives us those tools, which were the mitzvahs were there to create a framework of being able to balance these two things. So obviously, how it plays itself out at any given moment is more complex and complicated. But the framework is there. And so that's why the calendar was given the very first thing. It set out a mission statement for the Jewish people. On the one hand, we're here to bring God's message to the world. We're here to impose, almost, right? That's the masculine energy. We're here to say this is the truth. On the other hand, we have to cultivate in a way that is within the world. We have to find ways that it expresses itself within the world and not just throw it in their faces. So just to sum up, in short, the reason why the calendar was given as the very first mitzvah to the Jewish people, even before they went free, first of all, because freedom, you need to have control of time. As opposed to a slave whose time is controlled. Went a little deeper and said, not only is there control, but actually we control the time. The courts are the ones deciding when the calendar should be. It's the ultimate freedom. Not only can you manipulate time, control time, you actually manipulate time. You create the time. And in Philly, we say the actual specifics of the way the calendar works is guiding the Jewish people through their freedom. Because a free person can do anything they want and often get lost in that freedom. So you need a guiding hand how you should, which direction you should take that. And that's the way the specifics of the calendar were given to the Jewish people, setting them on a trajectory that we're still living out till today.
Wow.
Heavy.
Yeah.
Heavy.
Yeah. Wow. What a gift. An understanding gift
Yeah.
to be the first mitzvah. It's like objective and subjective and empathetic and
It's big.
yeah.
It's a lot to digest.
Yes. Slowly sinking in.
I know, it was a heavy duty.
Yeah. It was worthwhile hearing it, for sure.